The fluorescent lights at Marshall Space Flight Center hummed with their usual monotonous drone as Dr. Chloe Winters hunched over her desk, surrounded by a fortress of propulsion data printouts and holographic displays that flickered with trajectory calculations. The scent of stale coffee permeated the air, mingling with the sterile odor of recycled ventilation. She reached for her pen to annotate a propulsion efficiency chart when her vision began to blur at the edges, as if reality itself were losing resolution. The symbols weren't written in any language she recognized, yet she understood them, the way one understands the sensation of falling. An orbital structure emerged from the void of her vision, impossibly intricate, hovering above a curved representation of Earth that she recognized from satellite imagery. The construction was vast, segmented, and alive with purpose. Not through her eyes, through something deeper, more primal. The message seared through her neural pathways like an electrical current. Extraction begins in 90 days. You are the only mind we can reach. She knew because the timestamp on her computer screen had advanced, though to her it felt like either seconds or hours. Around her, colleagues had stopped mid-conversation, staring. Dr. Ramirez from Orbital Mechanics stood frozen with a coffee cup halfway to his lips. Jennifer from Propulsion Systems had her mouth slightly open, concern etched across her face. She pressed them flat against the cold surface of her desk, trying to ground herself in something physical, something real. The headache arrived like a spike driven through her skull from temple to temple, sharp and precise and utterly debilitating. She tasted copper in her mouth. Had she bitten her tongue? As she gathered her belongings with hands that refused to steady, two voices warred in her mind. The rational part of her, the part that had earned her doctorate, the part that solved differential equations for breakfast, screamed for a neurologist appointment, an MRI, a medical explanation. Seizure disorder, aneurysm, brain tumor. The possibilities cascaded through her mind with clinical precision. The other part, the part she desperately wanted to silence, whispered something far more disturbing. The vision had been too precise, too structured to be a hallucination. The mathematical relationships in those alien symbols had been coherent. The orbital mechanics had followed rules, even if they weren't rules she'd been taught. This wasn't the random firing of misfiring neurons. This was information. Her apartment in Huntsville was a shrine to minimalism and control. Every surface was clean, every object in its designated place. No clutter, no chaos, no reminders of the emotional wreckage she'd left behind in academia. Her morning routine unfolded with the precision of a launch sequence. Wake at 5:45, black coffee prepared in exactly 90 seconds, a precisely timed 30-minute workout that elevated her heart rate to 140 beats per minute, then a shower set to exactly 102 degrees Fahrenheit. By 7:15, she was reviewing her propulsion simulations at her kitchen table, triple-checking every calculation before saving them to the secure server. Control meant success. Control meant survival. During lunch, while others gathered in the cafeteria to discuss weekend plans and office gossip, Chloe sat alone in her cubicle, reviewing data on her tablet. No photos decorated her desk. No personal calls interrupted her workflow. She'd burned those bridges methodically, one by one. Her mother had stopped calling after Chloe dismissed her religious beliefs as emotional crutches for people who can't face reality. No romantic entanglements complicated her schedule. Vulnerability meant chaos, and chaos was the enemy. She'd learned that lesson the hard way during her academic career, when the pressure of perfection had crushed her beneath its weight. A prodigy who couldn't handle the spotlight, she'd found refuge in NASA contracts where the work was data-driven, predictable, and blessedly impersonal. She lived in a fortress of logic, and she preferred it that way. Emotions were variables she'd eliminated from her equations. It started sharp and localized above her right eye, unusual in its precision, She took her prescribed medication and tried to sleep, pulling the blackout curtains closed and setting her white noise machine to the ocean setting. The transmission arrived through channels she didn't know she possessed, bypassing her conscious mind entirely. The luminous entity introduced itself as a rogue Anunnaki agent, though those words meant nothing to her rational mind. What followed was a flood of fragmented images. Blue Origin launches trailing fire through darkness. Orbital trajectories plotted in three-dimensional space, a countdown that pulsed with urgency. The phrase, "the extraction," echoed through her consciousness, with syntax that felt fundamentally alien, as if translated through a medium not designed for human language. The rational voice kicked in immediately, providing explanations with comforting precision, stress-induced hallucination, her brain processing aerospace data during REM sleep and constructing vivid narratives. She'd been working 80-hour weeks. Sleep deprivation caused hallucinations. This was explainable. A specific launch trajectory for a Blue Origin mission, scheduled in 3 weeks, had been shown to her in perfect detail. Orbital inclination, 28.5 degrees. Circularization burn duration, 42 seconds at apogee. Payload separation at T plus 8 minutes 33 seconds. Her hands betrayed her with their trembling, but her mind remained sharp. She would conduct an experiment. If the trajectory matched reality after the launch, she would investigate further. If not, she would schedule a neurologist appointment and accept the medical explanation. Science demanded empirical testing. 3 weeks later, Chloe sat in her apartment as the Blue Origin mission executed its launch sequence. Her laptop was open to publicly available FAA launch data, a second monitor displaying NASA tracking information she'd accessed through her credentials. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, untouched. She watched the telemetry data populate in real time, each number appearing on screen like a verdict. Exact match. Energy signatures from the payload were anomalous. Power consumption patterns inconsistent with standard commercial satellites. The payloads themselves were undisclosed, listed only as proprietary commercial equipment. The trajectories, when plotted over multiple launches, formed a pattern, a grid spacing itself with mathematical precision around Earth's orbital plane. The specific data hadn't been publicly available until after the launch. She'd triple-checked. She'd run statistical analyses to determine if she could have extrapolated from existing data, and the probability was effectively zero. The entity's communication became more sophisticated, as if learning to interface with her neural architecture. It identified itself with increasing urgency, describing itself as a rogue element within the Anunnaki hierarchy, a dissenter warning humanity about a harvest that had been planned for millennia. You resist the influence that blinds others. You can see what they have hidden. You must act. The entity found her regardless, persistent, and increasingly desperate. The space was sterile and institutional, decorated only with framed mission patches and a photograph of the supervisor shaking hands with a senator. Chloe had prepared her presentation carefully, framing her findings as concerns about unauthorized near-Earth orbital construction. She mentioned nothing about visions, nothing about alien entities, nothing that would trigger immediate psychological evaluation. She presented trajectory analyses, energy consumption data, orbital spacing patterns that suggested deliberate construction. Her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Webb, listened with an expressionless face that gave away nothing. He asked a few perfunctory questions, thanked her for her diligence, and suggested she take some additional time off to rest. 2 men in dark suits appeared at her apartment on a Thursday evening, identifying themselves with credentials that read Interagency Security Liaison. They asked pointed, carefully worded questions about her mental health, her stress levels, whether she'd been sharing her theories with anyone outside the agency. Their questions were friendly in tone, but surgical in precision. After they left, Chloe sat in her silent apartment and understood with crystalline clarity that she had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. Whatever machinery she'd stumbled into, whether governmental, corporate, or something more inexplicable, it was now aware of her. The transmission was different, raw, as if the careful interface it had been constructing was being abandoned in favor of directness. They know you can see. They will attempt to discredit you, isolate you, silence you. The harvest window closes in 60 days. You must find proof they cannot suppress. You must move now. 2 possibilities existed, and she could no longer avoid choosing between them. Either she was chasing the truth, uncovering a conspiracy so vast and strange it defied rational comprehension, or she was spiraling into madness, constructing elaborate delusions from random data and hallucinations. She had perhaps days, maybe weeks, before she was completely neutralized, either discredited into irrelevance or disappeared into some bureaucratic black site for medical evaluation. Now she had something she'd never allowed herself before, a mission that mattered, regardless of the cost. She returned to her apartment after a mandatory psychological evaluation to find her filing cabinet drawer not quite closed, the metal edge protruding perhaps 2 millimeters beyond its usual flush position. She stood in the doorway, grocery bag in hand, scanning the minimalist space with the methodical precision she'd applied to trajectory calculations. The stack of papers on her desk had been rearranged. Not dramatically, but the top document was now a propulsion analysis she distinctly remembered burying 3 sheets deep. Her laptop sat on the kitchen counter, and when she touched the base, warmth radiated through the aluminum chassis. It should have been cold. She'd been gone for 3 hours. She opened the laptop and checked the system logs, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The machine had been active 47 minutes ago. Someone had accessed her files, copied data, and covered their tracks with professional competence. Not perfect competence. They'd left thermal evidence and incomplete log deletion, but good enough that most people wouldn't notice. The same dark blue sedan that had been parked across from her building for the past 5 nights sat in its usual spot, positioned with a clear sight line to her apartment. She documented it in her notebook. Make, model, license plate, arrival and departure times. The pattern was consistent. Surveillance didn't even bother hiding anymore. Not fired, that would have created documentation, potential legal complications. Instead, her supervisor had explained with practiced corporate sympathy that budgetary constraints and project restructuring meant her position was being phased out. The email arrived on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, her security credentials no longer opened the doors at Marshall Space Flight Center. Clean, efficient, permanent. Chloe tracked them through aerospace community forums, industry message boards, professional networking sites. Someone was conducting a careful campaign of reputation destruction. Posts appeared questioning her recent instability. Anonymous comments mentioned professional burnout and concerning behavior. A thread on an aerospace engineering forum devoted an entire discussion to brilliant minds lost to conspiracy thinking, with her name never explicitly mentioned, but clearly implied through contextual details only insiders would recognize. Chloe attempted to find allies, because even her hyper-rational mind understood she couldn't fight this alone. The first approach had been Michael Torres, an investigative journalist who covered the aerospace industry for a respected technology publication. She'd read his exposés on SpaceX safety violations and Boeing's troubled oversight. He seemed like someone who asked difficult questions and pursued uncomfortable answers. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Huntsville, one of those deliberately rustic establishments with exposed brick and overpriced espresso. Torres was in his 40s, carrying the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent years chasing stories that didn't want to be caught. Chloe presented her findings carefully: orbital anomalies, undisclosed payloads, construction patterns that suggested deliberate coordination between supposedly competing aerospace companies. She showed him the data, the trajectory analyses, the energy consumption patterns that defied commercial satellite operations. He promised to file Freedom of Information Act requests, to contact sources at the FAA to investigate. Not a direct threat, but a carefully worded letter expressing concern about potential defamation and reminding the publication of the serious legal consequences of publishing unsubstantiated allegations about proprietary commercial operations. The letter mentioned the publication's recent financial difficulties and the unfortunate necessity of defending against frivolous litigation. He slid a copy of the cease and desist letter across the table at their final meeting, his hands shaking slightly with what Chloe recognized as suppressed anger. He was a journalist, watching truth being strangled by corporate attorneys, and he was powerless to stop it. He left the coffee shop without finishing his drink, and Chloe never heard from him again. Marcus Webb, her former supervisor, had mentioned during one of their final conversations that Chloe might find common ground with others who shared her unconventional perspectives. The suggestion had been delivered with subtle mockery, but Chloe recognized it for what it was: a breadcrumb toward discrediting her further. He was a former aerospace engineer who'd left the industry 15 years earlier after claiming to witness evidence of extraterrestrial contact at a classified facility. His website was a chaotic mixture of legitimate technical analysis and wild speculation about reptilian infiltrators and hollow Earth theories. The space smelled of mildew and old paper, populated by perhaps 20 people whose eyes held the zealous certainty of true believers. Chen stood at the front, gesticulating wildly as he described interdimensional portals being opened by CERN and government mind control programs using chemtrails. Chloe sat in the back row, her scientific training recoiling from the utter absence of empirical rigor. When Chen spotted her and invited her to share her experiences with the Anunnaki, she declined and left, understanding with crushing clarity that association with these people would destroy whatever credibility she had left. You think your data makes you legitimate, but they'll paint you with the same brush regardless. We're all crazy to them. Enemies multiplied, while allies evaporated like water in vacuum. Dr. Raymond Kellner, the NASA psychological evaluator assigned to her case, had initially seemed sympathetic. Their first session had been almost conversational. He asked about her stress levels, her sleep patterns, whether she'd experienced unusual emotional responses to work pressure. His office was designed to be soothing: soft lighting, comfortable chairs, abstract art that suggested calm without demanding interpretation. Chloe recognized the pattern. He was constructing a genetic narrative of mental illness, building a case that her visions represented hereditary schizophrenia rather than external contact. Did she experience gaps in her memory, periods of lost time, unexplained physical symptoms? Chloe understood she was watching her credibility being systematically dismantled by a professional whose clinical manner masked a more sinister function. Who was feeding him information? The belief that medical professionals are conspiring against you rather than trying to help you. Her internet connection slowed to a crawl whenever she researched aerospace launches or orbital mechanics, as if her searches were being filtered through additional layers of scrutiny. She started using public libraries and internet cafes, paying cash, creating burner email accounts that lasted only hours before being mysteriously disabled. One morning, while retrieving groceries from her car, Chloe noticed a small, black device attached to the undercarriage near the rear axle. She recognized it immediately from her aerospace work: a GPS tracker, commercial grade, the kind used for fleet management and asset monitoring. Someone wanted to know everywhere she went, everyone she met, every pattern of movement in her increasingly constrained life. Removing it would signal awareness, might accelerate whatever plans were being constructed around her. Better to know she was being tracked and use that knowledge strategically. She began making random trips to grocery stores and parks, creating noise in the surveillance data, making her movements harder to analyze. Chloe spent evenings in her apartment, curtains drawn, eating meals she barely tasted while reviewing data on encrypted drives. No allies, no support network, no one who believed her or could help her even if they wanted to. The fortress of logic she'd built around her life had become a prison, and she was the only inmate. Then, on a night when sleep felt impossible and the weight of isolation pressed against her chest like physical force, the transmission arrived with unprecedented intensity. The entity's presence announced itself not with warning, but with overwhelming immediacy, bypassing her conscious defenses entirely. She saw how it functioned. Quantum entanglement arrays designed to interface with human consciousness at a fundamental level, extracting not physical resources but experiential substrate. The Anunnaki civilization, the entity explained through concepts that translated imperfectly into human understanding, was dying. Not physically, but culturally, spiritually. They'd achieved technological perfection and lost something essential in the process. Now they sought to rejuvenate themselves by stripping Earth of its accumulated consciousness, consuming humanity's experiential richness to revitalize their own exhausted existence. The vision shifted, showing her the aftermath, a future Earth where humans survived physically but existed as empty shells, going through the motions of life without understanding why. She saw cities full of people commuting to jobs, eating meals, engaging in conversations, but with something fundamental missing, the spark of genuine experience replaced by hollow automaticity. Chloe saw herself in that future, a hollow woman sitting in an empty apartment, staring blankly at a wall, alive but spiritually dead. Her brilliant mind reduced to basic functioning, still capable of performing tasks, but incapable of understanding purpose or meaning. The image was specific enough to feel prophetic, a glimpse of her own fate if the extraction succeeded. This is what they will take from you. The harvest window closes in 47 days. You must act now. The isolation felt complete. No allies among humans. Only an alien entity of unknown motivation, offering information she couldn't validate and demanding action she couldn't justify. She was either humanity's last hope or descending into elaborate structured madness, and she had no way to determine which. The living room was unrecognizable. A civilian-grade telescope, mounted on a reinforced tripod, dominated the space near the window, its lens pointed skyward through blackout curtains she'd modified with a precise viewing slit. Radio receivers clustered on her coffee table, their LED displays flickering with frequency data. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting homemade signal processors she'd soldered together from components ordered through anonymous accounts and delivered to P.O. boxes across 3 counties. The equipment represented months of her savings and countless hours of assembly, calibration, and frustrated failure. Her hands bore small scars from soldering burns, her eyes were permanently bloodshot from staring at monitors in darkness, and her sleep schedule had dissolved into whatever moments exhaustion demanded. The high-resolution tracking program she'd written pinged with an alert, an unregistered object passing through a specific orbital corridor the entity had described in one of the transmissions. Chloe's hands moved across the keyboard with practiced speed, adjusting telescope orientation, focusing the optics, initiating the capture sequence. The structure was massive, far larger than any legitimate satellite or space station, its architecture impossibly intricate. Geometric patterns repeated with mathematical precision, surfaces that seemed to shimmer even in the vacuum of space, configurations that matched the schematics from her visions with terrifying exactness. She cross-referenced the image against every database of registered orbital objects she could access: FAA records, NASA catalogs, International Space Agency registries. Nothing. The structure didn't officially exist. Her jury-rigged signal processor detected electromagnetic emissions inconsistent with any known technology, power consumption levels that would require multiple nuclear reactors, frequency patterns that suggested quantum-level information processing. This wasn't commercial. This wasn't scientific. This was something else entirely. Tangible, verifiable, empirical evidence. The rational part of her mind that had been screaming for proof finally had something to analyze, to measure, to confirm. But the handshake protocol, the basic architecture of the communication, was recognizable to someone with her training. She couldn't decrypt the content, but she could prove the connection existed. Blue Origin was communicating with something they claimed didn't exist. The visions were real. The entity was real. The extraction was real. Every moment of doubt, every whisper of madness, every suggestion of psychosis, all of it dissolved in the face of empirical data. Orbital mechanics calculations, demonstrating the structure's deliberate positioning. She compiled everything into a compressed archive, encrypted it with multiple layers of protection, and prepared to release it through anonymous channels. She would flood multiple channels simultaneously, making suppression impossible through sheer volume and distribution. The posts went live across multiple platforms within minutes. She watched them appear: forum threads, file-sharing sites, encrypted messaging boards. For approximately 4 minutes and 37 seconds, her evidence existed in the public sphere. Chloe's internet connection throttled dramatically, her bandwidth collapsing from gigabit speeds to barely functional dial-up equivalents. Error messages multiplied across her screens: connection timeouts, server unavailable, access denied. Her laptop fans spun louder, the machine's processing power suddenly hijacked by something she hadn't authorized. Not automated takedown requests or routine content moderation. This was active, intelligent, coordinated suppression happening faster than should be technologically possible. She tried rerouting through different VPNs, uploading through different accounts, using backup systems she'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Nothing worked. Every upload was identified and eliminated within seconds. Her primary laptop began exhibiting signs of remote access, cursor movements she didn't control, files opening autonomously, system processes terminating without her input. Chloe ripped the Ethernet cable from the wall and disabled the Wi-Fi, isolating the machine. But the damage was done. Her evidence had been scrubbed from the internet with surgical precision. She sat in the sudden silence of her apartment, lit only by the pale glow of dead monitors, and understood with crushing clarity that she'd underestimated the opposition. Whoever was protecting this secret had resources and capabilities that dwarfed anything she could counter with civilian equipment and hacker tutorials. She returned at 5:30 in the morning to find her door slightly ajar. She'd locked it. She always locked it. Muscle memory from years of obsessive security made that certainty absolute. Furniture overturned, couch cushions slashed, her carefully organized papers scattered across the floor like snow. The surveillance equipment she'd spent months assembling was smashed, telescope cracked, radio receivers crushed, signal processors reduced to fragments of circuit board and shattered components. Not just removed, physically torn from her computers with the cables still attached, ripped out with enough force to damage the mounting brackets. Every backup she'd created, every redundant copy of her evidence, gone. They'd known exactly what to take and where to find it. Last warning! That night, as she sat among the ruins trying to salvage what little remained, the entity appeared with a presence that felt different from previous transmissions. The usual authoritative certainty was replaced by something closer to desperation, even fear. The communication bypassed language entirely, pouring concepts directly into her consciousness with urgent, almost frantic intensity. The path of revelation leads only to your elimination. You must change tactics. You must force them into the light. Make them act publicly. Make them reveal themselves through their attempts to silence you. Your death serves no purpose. Your survival and strategic action might. But in a world where evidence could be scrubbed and truth could be suppressed, different weapons were required. Not data, but spectacle. Not proof, but provocation. The letter was written in the bureaucratic language of institutional compassion, but the threat was explicit. Kellner sat across from her with an expression of carefully calibrated sympathy that didn't reach his eyes, a professional mask he'd perfected over decades of practice. Their recommendation was unanimous: mandatory inpatient psychiatric evaluation, minimum duration of 72 hours, potentially extending depending on her response to treatment. "We want to help you." If she complied, she would be sedated, evaluated, and effectively neutralized. Any claims she made would be dismissed as psychotic delusions. Her credibility would be destroyed through official medical diagnosis. She'd emerge from the facility with a documented history of severe mental illness, permanently marked as unreliable and unstable. "The evidence," Chloe said quietly, testing whether truth had any value in this space. "The orbital structure, the intercepted transmissions, that was all real." Psychotic episodes create experiences that feel completely authentic. The brain constructs elaborate narratives to explain sensory experiences that aren't actually occurring. Paranoid schizophrenia in individuals with high cognitive function often manifests with remarkable internal consistency. The fortress of logic that had once protected her had become a prison. Her hyper-rationalism demanded empirical validation, but in a world where evidence could be suppressed and experts could be corrupted, rationality itself became a weapon turned against her. The very mind that had made her brilliant now condemned her as insane. The review board's recommendation is immediate. The orderlies outside are here to escort you to the facility. We can do this cooperatively, which I strongly recommend, or we can proceed with involuntary commitment. The outcome is the same, but the process can be more or less traumatic depending on your choice. She couldn't determine if Kellner genuinely believed she was mentally ill, or if he was a knowing participant in her suppression. The ambiguity was its own form of torture. Everything she was experiencing was either impossible, aliens don't exist, conspiracies of this magnitude can't remain hidden, or she was hallucinating, constructing elaborate delusions to process stress and trauma. Chloe stood slowly, her mind racing through scenarios and finding no viable options. 43 days until the extraction, according to the entity's most recent transmission. 43 days to stop something she couldn't prove was happening while locked in a psychiatric facility being treated for believing in something that might be real. They didn't grab her, didn't threaten, just positioned themselves to prevent escape. Professional, efficient, inevitable. Chloe sat on a narrow bed with a thin mattress that protested every movement, the springs creaking beneath her weight. White walls surrounded her, unmarked except for scuff marks near the floor where previous patients had kicked or scraped in moments of frustration or despair. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that seemed designed to prevent rest, casting everything in a flat, colorless illumination that made time feel suspended. The sedatives they'd administered during intake moved through her system like fog rolling through her thoughts. Not enough to render her unconscious, but sufficient to dull the sharp edges of her analytical mind, to slow the racing calculations that normally defined her consciousness. Her movements felt sluggish, her limbs responding a half-second late to commands from her brain. She raised her hand to her face and watched it move as if through water. The disconnect between intention and action, both fascinating and terrifying. The countdown advancing minute by minute while she sat trapped in this sterile room, chemically restrained and professionally discredited. Now even her freedom was gone. replaced by mandatory treatment for a condition she might or might not actually have. The visions arrived in rapid succession, barely allowing her consciousness to recover between transmissions. She saw the harvest timeline accelerating, construction milestones being achieved ahead of schedule, testing protocols being compressed, the activation window moving closer. The orbital platform was expanding, adding new sections with disturbing efficiency. Humanity's window for intervention was closing not in 40 days, but perhaps in 20, perhaps less. But the entity also showed her something else, something it had withheld during previous transmissions. The images were fragmented, incomplete, as if she were seeing classified information being inadvertently leaked through damaged encryption. She glimpsed competing factions within the Anunnaki hierarchy, power struggles over resources and jurisdictions. Territorial disputes played out across stellar distances. The extraction project wasn't a unified operation, but a contested enterprise with opponents and beneficiaries locked in complex political calculations. The most vivid transmission arrived 3 nights into her confinement, when the sedatives had reached a steady state in her bloodstream and her resistance to the altered consciousness they induced had diminished. The entity appeared not as the benevolent whistleblower it had initially presented itself as, but as something calculating and alien in ways that transcended mere extraterrestrial origin. It revealed the truth with clinical detachment, almost as if correcting a misunderstanding rather than confessing a deception. The entity was not opposed to the extraction out of compassion for humanity or ethical concerns about consciousness harvesting. It represented a rival Anunnaki faction that wanted access to Earth's accumulated experiential substrate for its own purposes. Humanity's consciousness was indeed a resource, but the battle wasn't between protection and exploitation. It was between different groups competing for exploitation rights. She was a pawn being moved across a board in a game played by incomprehensible intelligences, pursuing goals she couldn't fathom. Every vision she'd experienced, every piece of information she'd received, every impulse to act, all of it potentially manipulation by an intelligence that understood human psychology well enough to exploit it with surgical precision. The question that now crashed down on her with the full force of its existential implications. The intercepted transmissions could be random radio noise that her pattern-seeking brain had organized into meaningful signals that didn't exist. The more intelligent the individual, the more sophisticated and internally coherent the delusion became. She sat in her narrow bed in the psychiatric ward, chemically dulled but still capable of analytical thought, and confronted the fundamental epistemological crisis. How could she determine the difference between external reality and internal delusion when the only instrument available for measurement was the potentially compromised instrument of her own mind? The space was designed to appear welcoming, soft furniture in muted colors, motivational posters on the walls, windows with a view of the facility's garden. But the locked doors and the orderly station near the exit revealed the illusion. He invited patients to share their experiences, their progress, their challenges with recovery. Now, with medication and therapy, he understood those communications were auditory hallucinations produced by his brain's misfire. He spoke with the tired gratitude of someone who'd accepted a difficult truth. Capgras delusion, she'd learned it was called. The medication helped her recognize her loved ones again, though she admitted with painful honesty that sometimes the doubt still crept in. Structurally similar to the woman's belief in familial replacement, the specific content differed, but the underlying pattern was the same: elaborate narratives constructed to explain perceptions that existed only in the patient's compromised consciousness. That she'd photographed an unregistered orbital structure? The man had photographs of the divine visions he'd experienced, elaborate sketches that made perfect sense to him and looked like delusional ramblings to everyone else. That she'd intercepted encrypted transmissions. The woman could describe in precise detail the subtle differences between her real family and their replacements, differences no one else could detect. Kellner watched her with an expression that might have been genuine concern or professional assessment. After the session, he invited her to his office for an individual check-in. The space within the facility was smaller than his external practice, more utilitarian, but maintained the same therapeutic aesthetic. You haven't accepted your diagnosis or begun working with the medication protocol we've designed for you. That question, that doubt, is the beginning of insight. Most patients with your presentation remain absolutely certain of their delusional beliefs. The fact that you're questioning suggests your rational mind is starting to reassert itself, to rebuild trust in reality through structured treatment. This was her lowest point, Chloe realized. She could choose what the facility defined as sanity, accept the diagnosis, take the medication, learn to dismiss the visions as hallucinations produced by malfunctioning neurotransmitters. She could rebuild a quiet life within the boundaries of medicated stability, return to work eventually, perhaps in a diminished capacity. Accept that her brilliant mind had betrayed her, producing elaborate delusions that felt more real than reality itself. Continue fighting something that might exist only in her compromised consciousness, becoming more isolated, more certain of things that might not exist, until the boundary between Chloe Winters the scientist and Chloe Winters the institutionalized patient dissolved entirely. But as she sat in Kellner's office, chemically dulled but still capable of recognizing patterns, she understood something crucial. Every piece of evidence that couldn't be empirically validated strengthened the trap. The more she demanded certainty, the more uncertain she became. Chloe looked at the man across from her and realized she needed a different approach entirely. Not proof, not certainty, not rational validation. Something else, something her hyper-rational mind had dismissed as insufficient, but which might be the only path forward. The fortress of logic that had defined her life had become a prison, and the only escape was to abandon the demand for certainty that logic required. Either way required faith in something unproven, trust in perceptions that couldn't be validated. The sedatives were wearing off. She'd been palming them during distribution for the past 2 days, pretending to swallow while tucking them beneath her tongue, then spitting them into the toilet once the orderly moved on. Her mind was clearing, sharpening, returning to the analytical precision that defined her even as that precision had led her to this institutional cage. She would stop asking the unanswerable question, "Am I insane?" and start asking questions that could generate testable predictions. She would act as if the transmissions were real, even knowing they might not be, because action based on uncertain premises was better than paralysis demanding impossible certainty. Make predictions based on the entity's information, document them, and let independent observers validate or refute them. Remove herself from the equation entirely. "Give me exact launch dates for upcoming Blue Origin missions," she demanded silently, her thoughts directed at the presence in her consciousness. "Not approximations, exact dates down to the hour. Payload specifications for those launches," she continued, her mind cataloguing the information with the discipline of her aerospace training. Mass, volume, energy requirements, orbital insertion parameters. Others were anomalous, suggesting payloads far more massive and energy-intensive than disclosed. Chloe memorized every name, every connection, constructing a mental map of the conspiracy's architecture. The entity, whether real or a sophisticated projection of her subconscious, provided answers with consistent internal logic. Chloe tested the information against her aerospace knowledge, searching for details she couldn't possibly fabricate. Technical specifications that would require classified access or mathematical calculations beyond her immediate recall. Other details existed in domains she'd never studied, forcing her to make educated guesses about whether they represented genuine intelligence or elaborate confabulation. every claim structured for independent verification. Maria was newer to the facility than the other staff, still idealistic enough to question procedures, still troubled by the line between treatment and control. Chloe watched her interactions with other patients. The gentle way she explained medication side effects when other nurses simply administered pills, the extra time she took answering questions, the subtle expressions of doubt when Dr. Kellner dismissed patient concerns as symptomatic delusions. Chloe began engaging Maria in careful conversations during medication rounds, not about conspiracies or transmissions, about the weather, about Maria's nursing school experience, about the facility's protocols. She presented herself as rational, self-aware, someone questioning her own perceptions rather than insisting on their absolute validity. Or do you think sometimes people get caught in systems that prefer diagnosis to investigation? Instead, she focused on the aerospace anomalies, the unauthorized orbital construction, the suppression of evidence. She framed it as corporate malfeasance rather than extraterrestrial conspiracy, staying within the realm of plausible scandal rather than science fiction. Either I'm right and there's a legitimate aerospace scandal, or I'm wrong, and I need to accept that. But I can't determine that from inside my own head. Then I needed back orbital coordinates for the unregistered construction, presented as unauthorized near-Earth objects requiring investigation. Intercepted transmission metadata showing Blue Origin communications with unlisted orbital assets, framed as potential FAA filing violations and national security concerns. Trajectory analyses demonstrating coordinated launches following patterns inconsistent with commercial operations. She included the names Maria had provided, 17 Blue Origin personnel allegedly involved in unacknowledged projects. She added predicted launch dates for upcoming missions, including the unannounced 0300 hours mission 18 days away. She compiled signal frequencies and energy signatures, all documented with the technical precision of her aerospace background. No mention of Anunnaki, no consciousness harvesting, no entity transmitting visions into her neural pathways. This was framed purely as an aerospace industry scandal, corporate malfeasance, regulatory violations, potential threats to orbital safety and national security. Let others interpret the data. She just needed it verified and publicized. Specific amateur telescope coordinates that could capture high-resolution images of the orbital structure. Signal frequencies that radio enthusiasts could monitor to intercept transmissions. Questions to ask FAA officials about payload discrepancies. Calculations anyone with aerospace engineering background could verify. She created a dead man's switch, an automated system requiring her to check in every 72 hours. If she failed to authenticate, the data would automatically release to multiple recipients she'd carefully selected. Investigative journalists at publications large enough to resist legal intimidation. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Reuters. Once independent observers confirmed the orbital anomalies and corporate discrepancies, the story would develop its own gravity, pulling in resources and attention she could never marshal alone. Maria accepted it without comment, her expression suggesting she understood she'd crossed a line but believed the crossing was justified. Chloe presented herself as someone who'd gained insight into her condition, who recognized the need for ongoing treatment, who planned to comply with outpatient therapy and medication protocols. She left with prescriptions for antipsychotic medication, a schedule for mandatory outpatient therapy sessions, and a diagnosis that would follow her forever. Paranoid schizophrenia with delusional disorder, documented in medical records that would be accessible to employers, security clearance reviewers, anyone conducting background investigations. Chloe returned to her ransacked apartment to find it had been further violated during her psychiatric hold. Surveillance cameras were now visible in every room, no longer hidden but brazenly mounted in corners, their presence a message: rather than a secret. Her phone line had been tapped with equipment professional enough to suggest government or corporate security contractors. Through her window she could see agents stationed in a parked sedan across the street, not even bothering with the pretense of concealment. The dead man's switch would activate in 68 hours if she didn't check in. She had no intention of checking in. Whatever emerged from this crucible would be something different, someone forged by uncertainty rather than certainty, defined by action despite doubt rather than paralysis demanding proof. High-resolution images appeared on scientific forums, not fringe conspiracy sites, but respected astronomy communities. The structure's existence was no longer deniable. Aerospace engineers began analyzing the images, posting calculations about the construction's mass, energy requirements, and orbital mechanics that confirmed Chloe's initial assessments. A hacker collective that specialized in exposing corporate and government malfeasance released intercepted Blue Origin transmissions showing payload manifests inconsistent with FAA filings. The discrepancies were clear, documented, impossible to dismiss as clerical errors. The frequency and pattern of inconsistencies suggested systematic deception rather than administrative mistakes. A senior Blue Origin engineer named David Chen, who'd been quietly documenting irregularities for months but lacked the courage to come forward until Chloe's data dump created public attention. Chen confirmed the existence of classified contracts with unidentified clients, acknowledged the unauthorized orbital construction, and provided internal communications showing corporate leadership's awareness of regulatory violations. The story exploded across mainstream media within 72 hours. Not as an alien conspiracy, that interpretation remained confined to fringe theorists, but as a legitimate aerospace industry scandal involving unauthorized orbital construction, potential national security violations, and systematic regulatory deception by one of America's premier space companies. NASA suspended collaborative agreements with Blue Origin pending review. The SEC began examining whether the company had made material misrepresentations to investors. The orbital structure became a major news story, covered by every significant media outlet, analyzed by aerospace experts, investigated by government agencies with subpoena power. Chloe watched the developments unfold from her surveilled apartment, agents still stationed outside, cameras still recording her every movement. She'd succeeded in forcing the conspiracy into public view, but her own role remained invisible, buried beneath her psychiatric diagnosis and destroyed credibility. 31 days to determine whether the investigation she'd triggered would be fast enough, thorough enough, to stop something that might or might not actually be happening. The news coverage began as a trickle and became a flood. Chloe sat in her surveilled apartment, watching the story metastasize across cable news networks, each channel applying its own ideological filter to the data dump she'd triggered. On CNN, aerospace experts analyzed the leaked orbital coordinates on split screens, their faces serious as they discussed implications for national security. Fox News framed it as governmental regulatory failure, questioning why the FAA had allowed unauthorized construction to proceed unchecked. MSNBC focused on corporate accountability, featuring former Blue Origin employees who spoke anonymously about a culture of secrecy and regulatory circumvention. Financial analysts dissected quarterly reports looking for evidence of undisclosed projects. Congressional staffers made phone calls, scheduling hearings, subpoenaing documents. The machinery of public accountability ground into motion with bureaucratic inevitability. He sat across from a respected journalist in a setting designed to suggest serious conversation rather than damage control. His expression was calm, measured, almost pedagogical. Aerospace innovation requires confidentiality, especially when dealing with dual-use technologies that have both commercial and potential defense applications. We've been fully compliant with our contractual obligations, though we acknowledge that perhaps our communication with regulatory bodies could have been more robust. Bezos pivoted smoothly, emphasizing national competitiveness and the need for America to maintain technological leadership against adversaries. He invoked innovation, job creation, the American spirit of exploration. He neither confirmed nor denied the specific allegations, maintaining strategic ambiguity while projecting absolute confidence. Chloe watched from her apartment, the surveillance cameras recording her every reaction, agents still stationed in the sedan outside her window. She'd anticipated this response. The corporate deflection, the appeal to national security, the framing of oversight as bureaucratic overreach threatening innovation. What surprised her was how effectively it worked on public opinion. Within days, polling showed Americans divided not over whether Blue Origin had violated regulations, but over whether regulations should apply to visionary entrepreneurs advancing America's interests. Kellner to describe her paranoid delusions about alien conspiracies. The investigation she'd triggered was now completely beyond her control, proceeding through mechanisms that had no place for her participation. NASA, while publicly distancing itself from the controversy, quietly reviewed its own data on unregistered orbital objects and began asking uncomfortable questions about what their tracking systems had missed. Dual-use technology with implications for space-based weapons systems, national security vulnerabilities created by inadequate regulatory oversight. Each interpretation was plausible, supported by fragments of the evidence she'd provided, but none mentioned extraterrestrial intervention or consciousness harvesting. That narrative remained confined to internet conspiracy forums, where enthusiasts debated the true nature of the orbital construction with passionate certainty and zero institutional credibility. The mainstream discussion focused entirely on human corruption and regulatory failure, interpretations that fit within acceptable frameworks of reality. And they were investigating, with resources and authority she could never marshal alone. Whatever truth existed would be filtered through those investigations, interpreted through human frameworks, but at least it wouldn't remain hidden. Outside, the agents in their sedan shifted positions, one stepping out for coffee while the other maintained watch. The routine had become almost comforting in its predictability. But the presence materialized in her consciousness with the same overwhelming immediacy it always had, bypassing her defenses and filling her awareness. It wasn't a savior warning humanity out of compassion, nor a villain manipulating her for cruel purposes. It was profoundly alien, operating according to motivations and ethics that existed outside human frameworks of good and evil. The question of whether it was helping or harming humanity was meaningless. It was doing what served its purposes within a power struggle between entities whose very existence Chloe couldn't verify. The harvest will resume under different parameters, through methods your investigation has forced them to redesign. And you will never know if I was real or if you are the architect of your own unraveling. The question of your sanity is irrelevant. What matters is, did you change the outcome? The chronic headaches that had plagued her for months stopped instantly, not fading gradually but simply ceasing as if someone had flipped a switch. The visions ended. The sense of presence that had inhabited her consciousness for 12 weeks evaporated completely. She sat in her apartment waiting for the entity to return, for the familiar pressure behind her eyes that signaled incoming transmission. Nothing came. Just the ordinary noise of her own thoughts, uninterrupted by anything external or internal, depending on which interpretation of reality was accurate. She didn't know if the entity's departure proved it had been real, its mission complete or failed, or if it demonstrated that her brain had finally responded to medication and therapy, releasing her from delusions that had consumed her life. She filled her prescriptions for antipsychotic medication, and disposed of them unused, unwilling to chemically alter whatever had made her susceptible to the transmissions in case they resumed. She rebuilt a quiet life within narrow boundaries, working freelance aerospace consulting for clients who didn't conduct background checks or care about psychiatric diagnoses. The cameras remained, but the monitoring became less intensive, shifting from active observation to passive recording. She was being downgraded from active threat to manageable risk, a trajectory she recognized as evidence of successful neutralization. The Senate Commerce Committee had completed its comprehensive review of Blue Origin's activities and released a 400-page report that dominated news cycles for approximately 18 hours before being replaced by more immediate scandals. The company had exploited ambiguities in FAA regulations, had failed to disclose the full nature of classified contracts, had prioritized proprietary interests over transparency. The report documented systematic regulatory circumvention enabled by inadequate oversight mechanisms. New regulations were proposed, comprehensive frameworks designed to prevent future violations. Some of the orbital construction was ordered dismantled under FAA supervision. Other sections remained classified under national security exemptions granted after closed-door testimony from Defense Department officials, who claimed the technology served critical intelligence functions. Jeff Bezos announced his decision to step down from day-to-day operations, transitioning to an advisory role while new management implemented reforms. He faced no criminal charges. Prosecutors determined that while the company had violated regulations, proving individual culpability would be difficult given the complexity of corporate decision-making structures. The matter was officially considered resolved. The mainstream narrative crystallized around mundane corruption. A billionaire's company had bent rules in pursuit of profit and innovation, got caught through whistleblower disclosures and independent investigation, paid appropriate penalties, and implemented reforms. The system had worked slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately accountability had been achieved. Internet conspiracy theorists continued talking about aliens, analyzing the data dump Chloe had released for evidence of extraterrestrial involvement. They found patterns in the orbital construction that suggested non-human design principles. They interpreted the energy signatures as evidence of technology beyond human capability. They constructed elaborate theories about consciousness harvesting and interdimensional beings. They were dismissed as fringe elements, their interpretations ignored by serious analysts. The evidence she'd uncovered was verified by independent sources. The orbital construction existed, the corporate violations were documented, the regulatory failures were confirmed. Or had she simply exposed corporate malfeasance while experiencing elaborate psychotic episodes that happened to align with reality enough to be useful? She couldn't determine from inside her own potentially compromised consciousness whether the entity had been real or whether her brilliant mind had constructed sophisticated delusions to explain neural misfires. If it had been delusion, they were simply military satellites serving legitimate defense purposes. She had no way to distinguish between the possibilities. She'd forced some truth into the light, but how much remained in shadow she couldn't determine. But if the silence in her mind represented successful treatment of psychosis rather than mission completion, then the question itself was meaningless, just another fragment of elaborate delusion she was learning to recognize and dismiss. She'd acted despite uncertainty, choosing a path and committing to it without proof, and the consequences: destroyed career, psychiatric diagnosis, permanent credibility damage, were absolutely real, regardless of whether the catalyst had been genuine contact or sophisticated hallucination. She would accept the ambiguity because she had no other choice, and she would watch the sky, always watching, never knowing whether her vigilance was justified or just another symptom. Sarah Mitchell, the name she'd chosen with deliberate blandness, lived on the outskirts in a second-floor apartment above a hardware store that smelled perpetually of sawdust and motor oil. Her apartment was sparse in a way that suggested poverty or asceticism, depending on interpretation. A narrow bed with white sheets and a single pillow. A wooden table scarred with decades of use, purchased from a thrift store for $20. A laptop, newer than anything else in the space, an incongruity she hoped no one noticed. A single window overlooking a small park where children played and elderly couples walked their dogs through stands of ponderosa pine. No surveillance equipment, no aerospace journals, no remnants of the person she'd been. Chloe Winters had died, effectively if not legally, and Sarah Mitchell had emerged, a quiet woman who worked at the local library cataloguing historical documents, who wore her hair differently in a simple braid rather than the severe ponytail of her previous life, who dressed in plain jeans and flannel shirts that helped her blend into the local population. She'd severed herself completely from the aerospace community. Her email accounts were deleted, her professional networks abandoned, her security clearances permanently revoked. The congressional investigation had made her name briefly famous in certain circles, a cautionary tale about burnout and paranoia, about brilliant minds cracking under pressure and constructing elaborate delusions to explain their deterioration. Graduate students in aerospace engineering probably used her case as an example of what happened when you prioritized work over mental health. The pills dulled her thoughts just enough to keep the world stable, to prevent the sharp analytical edges that had defined her from cutting too deeply into possibilities and probabilities. She could still think, still reason, but the obsessive quality that had once driven her toward answers now felt muted, manageable. Margaret specialized in trauma recovery and life transitions, helping people process loss and rebuild identity after catastrophic change. Their sessions focused on establishing routine, developing social connections, learning to live in the present rather than fixating on the past or worrying about futures that might never arrive. Margaret believed Sarah Mitchell was recovering from a psychotic episode triggered by workplace stress, that she was rebuilding her life after a complete breakdown. This narrative was close enough to truth to be sustainable. They discussed coping strategies, mindfulness techniques, the importance of structure and community. Margaret encouraged her to join book clubs, to volunteer at the community center, to open herself to the possibility of friendship and connection. Sarah tried. She really did. She attended a knitting circle at the senior center, though her hands, trained for precision soldering and keyboard typing, struggled with the needles and yarn. She volunteered to shelve books at the library on weekends, chatting with patrons about mystery novels and local history. She went to the farmers' market on Saturday mornings, buying vegetables and fresh bread from vendors who smiled and made small talk about the weather. It was a kind of peace, this small, quiet life defined by routine and predictability, but it felt more like surrender than victory, more like exile than escape. She was living on the margins of her own existence, performing the role of Sarah Mitchell while Chloe Winters remained buried but not dead, a ghost inhabiting flesh that had learned to pretend at normalcy. Sarah returned from her library shift as the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in bands of orange and gold and deep purple. The package sat next to her door, a small cardboard box with no return address, no postage mark, no indication of how it had arrived or who had sent it. She brought it inside and set it on the wooden table, staring at it for several minutes while her heart rate elevated and her breathing became shallow. The therapist's coping techniques echoed in her mind. Ground yourself in the present. Identify 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear. She could touch the rough cardboard, the scarred wood, the cool glass of the water cup beside her medication bottles. She could hear the wind in the pines, children laughing in the park below, her own breathing. No markings, just anonymous digital storage containing unknown data. She could take an extra dose of medication and sleep, let the chemicals in her bloodstream smooth away the anxiety and the questions and the terrible possibility of knowing. A schematic filled the screen, rendered in the same alien geometry as her visions, the overlapping patterns that communicated meaning through mathematical relationships rather than linguistic symbols. But this schematic was different from the ones that had burned themselves into her consciousness months earlier. It had been updated, modified, marked with what appeared to be construction milestones and timeline projections. A date appeared at the top, 6 months in the future. Below it, new orbital coordinates, different from the previous platform's location, but following similar geometric patterns in their spacing and orientation. The implication crystallized with terrible clarity. The extraction was resuming, adapted to avoid the scrutiny that had exposed the first attempt. The psychosis had never been fully treated, just temporarily suppressed by medication and therapy and distance from triggering environments. And she was about to spiral again, sacrificing the fragile peace she'd constructed for another descent into obsession and madness. She looked tired, eyes shadowed with exhaustion that sleep never quite erased, cheeks slightly hollow from the appetite suppression caused by her medication, the face of someone who'd sacrificed everything for a truth no one believed. The face of someone who might be genuinely insane, but couldn't tell from inside her own compromised perception. The stars began emerging, points of light appearing one by one in the vast expanse above the pine trees. Somewhere among them, if the schematic was real rather than delusion, an orbital platform waited. Construction continuing, systems being tested, the countdown resuming toward extraction or harvest or whatever terminology applied to the stripping of humanity's accumulated consciousness. 2 choices presented themselves with binary simplicity: delete the file and choose sanity, accept that the package was either random coincidence or her own subconscious arranging circumstances to trigger relapse. Continue taking her medication, attending therapy, living as Sarah Mitchell in this quiet Montana town where nothing was expected of her except basic functionality and pleasant interactions with library patrons. Begin investigating again, following the implications of the new coordinates, attempting to verify whether the updated timeline represented genuine intelligence or elaborate confabulation. Sacrifice the peace she'd found, abandon the identity she'd constructed, return to the obsessive pursuit of truth that had destroyed her life once and would certainly destroy whatever remained if she chose that path again. The screen went dark, her reflection disappearing into black plastic and glass, but she didn't delete the file. Months of therapy and philosophical reflection had taught her that question was unanswerable from inside her own potentially compromised consciousness. External verification could be manipulated or misinterpreted. Internal certainty could be delusion. The epistemological crisis had no solution. Whether Sarah Mitchell could exist peacefully in this Montana town, knowing that somewhere in her laptop was information that might represent humanity's last warning about a threat no one else could see. Whether the cost of peace was complicity in whatever came next. She thought about the patients in group therapy at the psychiatric facility, the ones who'd learned to dismiss their perceptions as symptoms, who'd accepted their diagnoses and found relief in medication and structured treatment. They'd chosen a kind of sanity, and many seemed genuinely happier for it. They'd traded certainty for stability, and the trade had served them well. Kellner's voice, gentle and clinical, explaining that the need to feel special, to believe one possessed unique knowledge, was itself a symptom of certain disorders. That the grandiosity of thinking you alone could see truth hidden from everyone else was evidence of delusion rather than insight. What matters is, did you change the outcome? Or she could do what Chloe Winters would have done, interrogate the data, demand verification, force the question into the light, regardless of personal cost. The schematic reappeared with a single keystroke, the alien geometry pulsing with meaning or madness, depending on interpretation. Her hand moved toward the keyboard, hesitated, continued. She began typing commands, searching for ways to verify the coordinates, cross-reference the timeline, determine whether the information represented genuine intelligence or sophisticated delusion. She sat motionless in the darkening room, listening to the wind and her own breathing, feeling the weight of possibility and the terror of uncertainty. The story ended there, without resolution, because the truth, if it existed, was still out there, and Chloe Winters or Sarah Mitchell or whoever she actually was beneath the layers of diagnosis and medication and self-imposed exile was still the only one who could see it, or the only one who thought she could. The difference remained unknowable, the choice remained unmade, and the file remained saved on a USB drive in a sparse apartment in Montana where a woman who'd sacrificed everything for truth sat in darkness, wondering whether truth was worth another sacrifice, or whether truth existed at all beyond the constructed narratives minds generated to explain experiences they couldn't process. The orbital platforms, real or imagined, continued their functions, and Sarah Mitchell sat in silence, the laptop closed, the file saved, the choice deferred but not abandoned, living in the terrible space between action and inaction, where sanity and delusion became indistinguishable, and the only certainty was uncertainty itself. The library's archives room smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, that particular scent of history being carefully maintained for future generations who might never care. Chloe, still answering to Sarah Mitchell in this life, sat at a wooden work table cataloguing a collection of local photographs from the 1950s. Black and white images captured moments frozen in silver halide emulsion. Main Street, when it had only 3 stores, the elementary school before the addition, families posed in Sunday clothes outside the church that had burned down in 1967. No cosmic consequences to documenting the names of children playing in front of the hardware store that now housed her apartment. Just quiet, methodical preservation of moments that mattered to people who were mostly dead now. She arrived precisely on time, completed her assignments with meticulous accuracy, and left without lingering for the social conversations that clustered around the staff coffee maker. Martha, the head librarian, had stopped inviting her to after-work gatherings after the 5th polite decline. Tom, who managed the reference desk, made occasional attempts at friendly conversation but accepted her brief responses without apparent offense. She'd built a small life within careful boundaries. The library from 9 to 5 on weekdays, grocery shopping on Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, therapy with Margaret every other Thursday, medication taken faithfully with dinner, washed down with water from the tap, a walking routine through the park on evenings when the weather permitted, books borrowed from the library and read in her sparse apartment before sleep. It was a life designed for stability rather than meaning, for routine rather than purpose. But stability was its own form of victory after what she'd survived, or what she'd inflicted upon herself, depending on which interpretation of her history was accurate. It existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, present but inactive, available but unexamined. She'd learned to live alongside it the way one learned to live with chronic pain or the memory of someone lost, neither ignoring it completely nor allowing it to dominate consciousness. The pills dulled certain edges of thought, created a slight lag between perception and analysis that she'd learned to compensate for through routine and structure. Margaret said the medication was working well, that Sarah was making excellent progress in her recovery. Margaret asked about her mood, her sleep, her social interactions, whether she'd experienced any recurrence of the intrusive thoughts that had characterized her psychotic episode. Chloe answered with careful honesty, reporting the absence of visions and transmissions, acknowledging the ongoing work of rebuilding a life after catastrophic breakdown. She classified her experience as occupational stress triggering acute psychotic episode with paranoid features, the diagnosis Dr. Kellner had documented, the explanation that fit within acceptable medical frameworks. She recited this classification when asked about her past, delivering it with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd accepted a difficult truth about themselves. It was safer than believing the transmissions had been real, and after 6 months of medication and therapy and cataloguing historical photographs, she'd almost convinced herself that acceptance was the same as truth. Chloe went there during her afternoon break to pour coffee, her movements automatic and unreflective. She poured coffee into a ceramic mug that said "Montana Proud" in faded letters, added milk from the refrigerator, stirred with a plastic spoon. She looked up at the television screen where a perfectly groomed anchor sat next to a graphic showing a rocket on a launch pad. The caption read, "Space Industry Resumes After Congressional Investigation." Video footage showed the rocket, sleek white metal gleaming in artificial lighting, technicians moving around the base performing final checks. Her breath caught. The coffee mug trembled in her hand, liquid sloshing against the ceramic edge. The launch date was today, exactly 6 months after the package had arrived at her apartment, exactly as the schematic had predicted. The timeline that had seemed like either prophecy or delusion was unfolding with precision that defied coincidence. She could retrieve the USB drive, cross-reference the coordinates, analyze the orbital trajectory being described in the news report. She could check energy signatures once the payload reached orbit, compare the construction patterns to the predictions in the schematic. She could determine whether the extraction was genuinely resuming or whether her mind was finding patterns in random data the way it had supposedly done during her psychotic episode. She could trigger another investigation, contact independent aerospace analysts, provide the predictive schematic as evidence, demonstrate that someone or something had known about this launch 6 months before it was publicly announced. Force the question into the light again, risk exposure and scrutiny, and the possibility of being dismissed as a psychiatric patient experiencing relapse. Or she could finish pouring her coffee, add the sugar she usually forgot, return to her desk and continue cataloguing photographs of people who died decades ago. She could choose the stability she'd built, the small, safe life that asked nothing of her except routine competence and pleasant interactions with co-workers who knew nothing about orbital mechanics or consciousness harvesting or the terrible weight of knowing things that might not be true. Again, always again, the same choice wearing different faces, presenting itself in coffee-scented break rooms instead of ransacked apartments, but fundamentally unchanged. Believe and act, risking everything, or dismiss and survive, accepting carefully bounded existence. Just finished, it's all yours. She could open it. She could verify. She could know, or at least accumulate more evidence in the endless epistemological crisis of determining what knowing actually meant when you couldn't trust your own mind. A photograph emerged from layers of tissue paper, Main Street in summer of 1952, children playing on sidewalks when the world had seemed simpler, when the sky above Montana had contained only clouds and the occasional airplane, before satellites, before orbital construction, before the question of what circled overhead had become an ontological crisis. She picked up her pen and began writing the catalogue entry in careful handwriting that Margaret said was evidence of her improved fine motor control, her enhanced ability to focus on present tasks rather than fixating on delusional narratives about alien conspiracies. Future unknown. And perhaps something else, or perhaps nothing else, depending on whether her mind could be trusted or whether it remained the brilliant, fractured instrument that had constructed elaborate delusions to explain neural misfires. The news report continued playing in the break room, where no one was watching, describing the successful launch, the orbital insertion, the payload deployment that would proceed according to schedule. Was the extraction real? And if so, had it been stopped or merely delayed by her actions? Had her sacrifice of career and credibility and freedom mattered, or had she destroyed her life, chasing phantoms generated by malfunctioning neurotransmitters? But the interpretation remained contested. Human corruption or alien conspiracy, corporate malfeasance or extraterrestrial intervention, mundane explanation or cosmic stakes. Open the laptop and verify the coordinates, collapsing possibility into determination. Or leave it closed and preserve the quantum uncertainty that allowed her to function within the boundaries of her medicated stability. The routine cataloguing of historical photographs gave her days shape and purpose that existed independent of cosmic questions about consciousness harvesting and orbital platforms. The opposite of the visions that had consumed her, the transmissions that might have been contact or might have been psychosis, depending on which version of reality was accurate, and whether that question even had an answer that existed outside the observer's potentially compromised consciousness. That was the terrible gift of the ambiguous ending, the refusal to provide resolution, to choose between interpretations, to declare definitively whether the protagonist was hero or victim, whether her actions mattered or whether she'd simply destroyed herself, chasing delusions her brilliant mind had constructed. The USB drive remained unexamined. The choice remained deferred, but not abandoned, existing in the same state of quantum uncertainty as every other question about her experience. And somewhere overhead, visible only to those with the right equipment and the willingness to look, satellites traced their paths through vacuum, serving purposes that were classified or commercial or catastrophic, depending on who was watching and what they chose to believe about the structures circling silently above Montana's vast blue sky.